In Skynet's long fight against humanity, also known as the Future War, Skynet made many mistakes that led to a human victory. But one of the biggest and probably most overlooked mistake of all is the introduction of plasma weaponry to the battlefield. These weapons, even though very effective against humanity, also were extremely effective against HK variants and Terminators, and ultimately led to humanity's ability to counter Terminators effectively. So let's look into why plasma weapons were probably Skynet's biggest undoing. Firstly, we must go into what plasma weapons actually are. Well, plasma weapons fire bolts of superheated ionized gas via an electromagnetic sheath, kind of like a railgun. They fire these at fairly decent ranges at high rates of fire that can do absolutely devastating damage to their opponents. And in the Terminator Universe, Skynet invented the plasma technology used in the weaponry and introduced it to the battlefield fairly early on in the Future War, depending on which film or which series you're following, and eventually it led to humanity capturing these, using them themselves, and eventually reverse engineering it and producing their own plasma weapons, which they used to great effect against the Terminators. Now, the stats of the plasma weapons varies massively depending on the type. There's everything from plasma rifles all the way up to the equivalent of main battle tank cannons, which are obviously massive plasma cannons. But we'll go through some basic stats to show you the potency of the weapons. So a single plasma bolt could deliver between 500 kilojoules up to 2 megajoules of energy. To put this into perspective, a 50 caliber heavy machine gun round has around 20 kilojoules of energy. So massively powerful. They also caused explosive damage upon hitting, so they would combust, causing intense heat and a concussive force around it. So basically every single shot was like a small high explosive round as well. The heat of plasma could be anything from 5,000 degrees up to 50,000 degrees Celsius, so hotter than the surface of the sun and even hotter than lightning strikes, meaning that it could obviously melt flesh, bone, and metal. When it came to penetration, standard plasma bolt could go through the equivalent of 25 centimeters of steel, which means most plasma bolts could penetrate armor, armored personnel carriers, aircraft, and concentrated fire from even lighter weapons could even penetrate the equivalent of main battle tanks over time, and obviously plasma cannons could completely annihilate them. When it came to range, effective range of standard weapons was around 500 meters, but it went everything up to about 3,000 meters, or even bigger for the larger weapons. And the speed of the round was a bit slower than standard kinetic ammunition, but still fast enough that it was difficult to dodge. But a lot of the pros kind of outweigh the cons of that. And when it came to accuracy, they were very accurate, even a small laser being deployed from the weapon system to clear the path for the plasma bomb before firing, so extremely high tech. And when it came to rate of fire, most weapon systems actually were similar to standard kinetic energy weapons of the time, or even beating them, which obviously meant it was very effective. And basically, yeah, plasma weapons basically beat kinetic weapons in pretty much every area. And when it came to mobility, weight was heavier than standard kinetic weapons, but obviously that didn't matter too much to Terminators or the vehicles. And when it came to ammunition, most weapons cells charged between 50 and 100 shots when it came to the rifles. And obviously larger plasma cannons tended to be powered by a fusion core inside the vehicles, and they had large amounts of ammunition stocked inside of them, so it varies on different vehicles. So yeah, plasma weapons had massive upsides, but obviously some downsides as well, which are to come. So now I've gone through plasma weapons and what it can do on the battlefield. Let's go through the pros and cons of why Skynet would bring them to the Future War battlefield. So, firstly, if we think about how Skynet thinks about things, it's a machine, it's going to think very logical. Plasma weapons outdo small arm or standard kinetic weapons, should I say, in pretty much every way possible. So, in just pure logical terms, there's no reason Skynet wouldn't deploy them to the battlefield. They just outperform standard kinetic weapons so well that Skynet probably wouldn't think of the downsides and would just think, right, get them to the battlefield. They do more damage to the resistance, they'll kill more humans, more effective. It's a very simple kind of choice for it, really. Then there's also the tactical flexibility offered by the plasma weapon. You got to think things like a T-600 deployed to the battlefield might be using a 7.62 minigun. Now this thing will tear infantry and light vehicles apart, but when it came up against things like armored personnel carriers or maybe certain aircraft or main battle tanks, it would mean that T-600 could do very little. Well, once they had a plasma weapon, everything except the most heavily armed and advanced weaponry were vulnerable to it. It could deal with infantry, light armor, medium armor. It could even deal with main battle tanks with enough hits. It could definitely damage a main battle tank, and it could destroy it potentially. I'd say almost absolutely with enough firepower. It meant that standard hunter killers and terminators could deal with every threat that the resistance offered once it was armed with plasma weaponry. So extremely tactically flexible, and it gave Skynet more power projection with smaller amounts of units. So very useful. Then people have brought up the logistical advantage. Now, you have to think Skynet had access to huge amounts of weaponry from the pre-war, and obviously it was using various kind of weapon systems, missiles, rockets, various small arms. These all had to have ammunition and ordnance manufactured for them. Now, it did obviously have industry, but you got to think the resistance was constantly doing guerrilla attacks and raids against Skynet, which would disrupt its logistics. So once it got plasma technology, which was using ionized gas, the hydrogen, if it could make this on such a large scale, it basically had a universal ammo type, which logistically made it far simpler for Skynet. Even though this is a more advanced than making standard ammunition, it does have its advantages. So logistically, you could argue that plasma weapons are the smart choice, especially for a high-tech entity like Skynet, which was very logical, very organized, very efficient. And then something that other people might have overlooked is the psychological impact. Plasma weaponry is horrendous. It can cause third-degree burns just going near you. And it's bad enough seeing your friend be blown to bits by a machine gun, but can you imagine plasma rounds hitting them, vaporizing them, burning them alive, and if it hits one of the limbs, it literally just tears it off. The effect would terrify resistance fighters, and things like untrained soldiers and civilians would flee in terror. And really, it is not only an effective weapon, but a true terror weapon indeed. Now let's talk about the cons to deploying plasma weaponry to the battlefield. And there's two main ones that I believe may have led to not only major damage to Skynet during the future war, but the eventual downfall and loss to humanity. So first is the reliance on advanced industry. And this was not just to produce the ammunition for the plasma weapons, but the production of the plasma weapons themselves. Obviously, Skynet, to produce these weapons, would have had to create brand new advanced industry. It couldn't rely on old tech because plasma weapons simply didn't exist before the future war. And these would require not only advanced production methods, but also more advanced rare earth materials and things like that over standard kinetic energy weapons. So obviously that meant that industry became not only highly vulnerable to attack because these advanced factories and stuff would have been on the resistance hit lists, but also meant that Skynet had to produce them from scratch. They couldn't just, take over an old ammunition plant that had survived or an old weapons factory. And there was no stockpile of plasma weapons either, so it wasn't easy access. So Skynet did have to put considerable resources into plasma weapon production. And the main one was they produced a weapon and brought it to the battlefield that made their Terminators now vulnerable to this weapon. Terminators and HK vehicles were very tough to kill. Obviously, if you've seen Terminator Salvation, they're a different type of Terminator film. You'll see John Connor, played by Christian Bale, fire an M60 point blank into a T-600's head. It takes about 10 plus rounds to kill it. Bear in mind this T-600's already been blown in half. And it shows how resilient Terminators are. And obviously, if you've seen Terminator 1 or 2 with Arnold Schwarzenegger in, you'll see that he's a T-800. He takes hundreds of rounds in both films from various calibers of kinetic weapons, MP5s, revolvers, shotguns, rifles. It basically does nothing to him. And he even fights the T-1000, the liquid Terminator, and it still takes considerable damage to kill a Terminator. But now the plasma weapons are on the field and the resistance have captured them, and they turn them against Skynet. All of a sudden, the Terminator, which was nearly unkillable to standard kinetic small arms and even some of the larger kinetic weapons, could now be killed in 1 or 2 shots. And all of a sudden, Skynet's nearly unkillable machines are vulnerable. And these plasma weapons could also deal with HK aerials and HK tanks. And before the plasma weapons were in the resistance hands, to deal with a Terminator, you need something like, a Carl Gustav launcher and an RPG, or something like a 50 caliber heavy machine gun and above in kind of damage and penetration. And you still needed multiple hits against Terminators to kill them. And even when you blew off limbs and did catastrophic damage, a lot of these vehicles, machines could fight on, whereas obviously plasma weaponry with its intense heat, if you hit a Terminator, the fact that it didn't just do massive damage, it also did insane amounts of heat damage. It could melt the metal and damage the electronics and damage the systems on the Terminator. So Skynet gave the Resistance the weapon to actually fight back, not just in small scale fights, but also to make their Resistance infantry, which were fighting guerrilla war, now able to deal with all of Skynet's threats. So all of a sudden, these small Resistance teams that were going in and maybe attacking a T600 or a T400 or a HK tank here or there could now deal with any threat they came up against. And also, you have to think the kind of combat before the plasma rifle was there. If you had anti-tank weapons, if you came up against a T600 in close quarters, these weapons aren't that wieldly, should I say. They're not easy to deploy, which meant T600 had a massive advantage. And when it came to things like a T800 and Infiltrator, if that got to your position and you only had small arms, these things were fast. They could run, they could jump, they could sprint, they could climb. They would rip you to pieces. But once you had the plasma weapons, you could engage them in close combat pretty well, because plasma rifles worked just like small arms rifles, but better in every way. And if it wasn't for the introduction of these plasma weapons, the Resistance would have never been able to get the upper hand in a lot of these conflicts. And to deal with things like HK aerials and HK tanks, they would still have to deploy specialist anti-tank weapons, which were in short supply and weren't so easy to deploy. And yeah, basically, the plasma weapon gave the Resistance the means to fight back and finally defeat Skynet. And it was Skynet's undoing. I can't see any other way that the plasma weapon actually benefits Skynet more than it hurts it. I think this video lays out the points, pretty well. And I kind of made it more to see if anyone can kind of tell me why plasma weapon pros outweigh the cons, because I actually don't see it doing it. And obviously, there's not too much info in the films. Obviously, you see the Future War in Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, but kind of Terminator Salvation does have plasma weapons on certain various vehicles, like the HK aerial, the Moto Terminators, and the big robotic walking Terminator. And they're the larger variants, but they show the damage they can unleash on the enemy. And these, can you imagine the Resistance, for instance, rips off the plasma weapons off a Moto Terminator? All of a sudden, they've got a weapon that can deal with a Terminator fairly efficiently. Whereas if these things were just armed with standard machine guns or 50 calibers, Resistance might be able to steal them off some, but they're not that effective against machines. So yeah, really, all I can say is Skynet really screwed the pooch on this one, so to speak. They didn't do very well. They should have stuck to standard kinetic weapons, and they might have won the future war and destroyed all of humanity. But I guess we'll never know. Anyway, just a bit of a different video, just an idea that's been floating around in my head. So like, subscribe if you enjoyed it, and obviously do leave comments and tell me why you thought I was right or why I was wrong. All constructive criticism is welcome. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone, and you guys have a beautiful evening.